The mop squeaked on the tile. Rashid pushed it slow, careful not to splash the shoes passing by. The mall smelled like coffee and new clothes. A man in a gray suit stopped in front of him. "Did I tell you to stop?" the man said. Rashid looked up. "No, sir." The man pointed at the floor. "Then why is it still dirty?" "It's clean," Rashid said. "I just finished." The man leaned close. "Too close. Your kind always says that." Rashid felt heat rise in his chest. He kept his voice low. "I work here. I follow the rules." The man laughed. "You work here because nobody else will." People slowed. A woman with a stroller. Two teens with phones. Rashid dipped the mop again. The bucket rattled. "Look at you," the man said. "Playing janitor like it's a career." Rashid's hands shook. He kept moving. The man snapped his fingers. "Hey! Eyes on me." Rashid froze. "Say it," the man said. "Say you messed up." "I didn't," Rashid said. The man's smile thinned. "You want to make this hard?" A security guard glanced over. Looked away. The man raised his voice. "This is my mall. I decide who belongs." Rashid met his eyes. "Then write me up." The man stepped back. "Oh, I will." He lifted his radio. "I've got a problem with a cleaner." Rashid felt the room close in. "Problem how?" the radio crackled. The man looked at Rashid. "Non-compliant." Rashid swallowed. The man pressed the button. "Send me backup." Rashid's phone buzzed in his pocket. "Unknown number. Start phase 1." Rashid didn't move. The footsteps were already coming. Rashid pushed the mop across the shiny tile. The mall lights buzzed above him. His badge said cleaning staff in blue letters. His real badge was hidden in his shoe. He kept his head down. A man in a gray suit stopped near him. "You missed a spot." Rashid looked. The tile reflected the ceiling lights. "It's clean, sir." The man's jaw tightened. "You arguing with me?" "No, sir." "Then clean it again." Rashid dipped the mop. The man folded his arms. "Slowest worker I've seen today." Rashid felt eyes on him. A woman by the coffee stand. Two teens by a shoe store. He scrubbed harder. The man said, "Do you people train at all?" Rashid paused. "I follow the schedule." The man stepped closer. "Don't talk back." "I wasn't," Rashid said. "Your tone says otherwise." Rashid swallowed. Note it, he thought. Public reprimand. "Name?" the man asked. "Rashid." The man smirked. "Figures." Rashid kept mopping. "I'm Blake Turner," the man said. "Operations manager." "Means I decide who stays." Rashid nodded. "Yes, sir." Blake pointed at the bucket. "You spilled water." A small puddle spread near Rashid's boot. "I'll wipe it." "Now you care." Rashid grabbed a cloth. Blake raised his voice. "See this? This is why standards drop." A man with a stroller slowed. Rashid crouched. Blake said, "Stand up." Rashid stood. "Look at me." Rashid looked. "You think this is a joke?" Blake said. "You treat my floor like a sidewalk." "I don't." Blake laughed once. "Always excuses." Rashid felt heat in his ears. "Stay neutral." Blake leaned in. "You know what people say about workers like you?" Rashid didn't answer. "They say you need watching." Rashid said, "I'm working." "Barely." A security guard walked by. "Guard," Blake said. "Come here." The guard stopped. "Yes, sir?" "This cleaner won't follow orders." Rashid said, "I'm cleaning." The guard looked between them. "Sir, is there a problem?" Blake said, "He's being difficult." Rashid felt his heart beat faster. "I asked him to redo a spot," Blake said. "He argues." "I didn't," Rashid said. Blake's eyes hardened. "See?" The guard said, "Just do what he says." Rashid nodded. "I will." Blake waved a hand. "Then hurry." Rashid bent again. A teen lifted a phone. Blake noticed. "Hey, no filming." The teen hesitated. Blake snapped. "I said no filming." The teen lowered it. Rashid wiped the puddle. Blake said, "What's that smell?" "Cleaner," Rashid said. "Smells like you." Rashid froze. Blake said, "Did I say stop?" Rashid moved again. Blake paced. "You know why we get complaints?" Rashid stayed silent. "Because workers like you don't respect the space." "I respect it," Rashid said. Blake's smile faded. "Careful." Rashid felt fear in his chest. "Power test." Blake said, "Clock out." "It's not my break." "I said clock out." Rashid stood. "I'm on duty." Blake's face reddened. You don't decide that. Rashid looked at the floor. Yes, sir. Blake raised his radio. Security to electronics wing. The guard stiffened. Blake said, non-compliant cleaner. Rashid felt a buzz in his pocket. He didn't check it. Blake said, you want to lose your job? I want to finish it. Blake leaned closer. You don't belong here. Rashid felt the words hit him like cold water. A woman whispered, that's harsh. Blake turned. Mind your business. She looked away. Blake said, see? Even they know. Rashid's throat tightened. Record. Remember. Say it, Blake said. Say you messed up. I didn't. Blake laughed. Then you're a liar too. Rashid felt his jaw clench. He forced it loose. Blake said, you got an attitude. I have work. Blake pressed the radio. I need another unit. The guard said, sir, it's just a cleaner. Blake glared. And? The guard went silent. Blake said, you think you're special? Rashid met his eyes. No. Then act like it. Rashid nodded. Blake stepped back. Wait here. He walked off. Rashid stood by the bucket. His hands shook. The teen lifted his phone again. Rashid whispered, it's okay. The teen nodded. Footsteps returned. Blake came back with another guard. There he is, Blake said. Refuses orders. Rashid said, I'm cleaning. Blake pointed. He talks back. The guard said, sir, we can escort him out. Rashid's stomach dropped. Blake crossed his arms. Do it. Rashid felt them all tilt. His phone buzzed again. He looked down. Text, Phase 1 confirmed. Rashid raised his head. The guard stepped closer. Blake smiled. Let's go, the guard said. Rashid didn't move. Hands where I can see them, the guard said. Rashid lifted his hands slowly. I didn't do anything. Blake folded his arms. He's refusing orders. I'm following them, Rashid said. I'm cleaning. The second guard stepped closer. Sir, just come with us. To where? Rashid asked. Office. Blake said, so we can document his behavior. Rashid's chest tightened. Document what? He looked at the floor. Wet streaks still showed. I didn't break a rule, Rashid said. Blake pointed. He's arguing again. The first guard sighed. Let's go. Rashid took one step. Then another. People watched. A woman with a coffee cup. The teen with the phone. A store clerk pretending to fix a display. Blake walked behind them. Make sure he doesn't run. Rashid felt heat rise in his neck. Run. He kept his eyes forward. The guard said, name? Rashid. Badge. Rashid showed the cleaning badge. Blake laughed. See. Temporary staff. Rashid said, I'm scheduled. Blake said, not anymore. They reached a small office near the escalator. The door shut. The air smelled like old paper. The guard said, sit. Rashid sat. Blake stayed standing. You embarrassed me out there. I just worked, Rashid said. You challenged me. I cleaned the floor. Blake leaned on the desk. You don't talk back to management. I answered questions. Blake smirked. Your tone was wrong. The guard looked at Rashid. Did you raise your voice? No. Blake said, he did. Rashid felt his jaw tighten. 2 stories. 1 power. The guard said, sir, we just need this to end. Blake said, then remove him. For what? The guard asked. Blake said, disrupting operations. Rashid said, I was told to clean. Blake snapped, stop. Silence filled the room. Blake said, look at him. Acting calm. Like he's innocent. Rashid said, I am calm. Blake laughed. See. The guard rubbed his forehead. Sir, maybe a warning? Blake shook his head. If we let this slide, they all push. They? Rashid asked. Blake's eyes flashed. Workers. Rashid said, we're people. Blake waved a hand. Don't twist my words. Rashid looked at the door. He could hear voices outside. The teen's phone light flashed under the crack. Blake noticed. Open that door. The guard opened it. The teen stood there. Blake said, delete that video. The teen said, I didn't do anything. Blake said, you're recording staff. I'm recording you, the teen said. Blake's mouth tightened. Security, handle this. The guard hesitated. Sir. Blake said, now. The teen stepped back. I have a right. Blake said, not here. Rashid stood. He's just watching. Blake turned. Sit down. Rashid stayed standing. The guard looked at Rashid. Please sit. Rashid sat. The teen left. Blake closed the door. Blake said, You see what you cause? I didn't, Rashid said. Blake said, You create scenes. Rashid whispered, You made one. Blake leaned closer. Say that again. Rashid felt fear. Pressure test. I said nothing, Rashid said. Blake straightened. I'm writing you up. For what? Rashid asked. Attitude. That's not a rule. Blake said, It is today. The guard said, Sir, maybe we let him finish his shift. Blake said, No. Rashid's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Blake said, Escort him back. Watch him. The guard said, Yes, sir. They walked out. People stared. Blake said loudly, Do your job. Rashid nodded. The guard whispered, Just clean and keep quiet. I was, Rashid said. They stopped near the spill again. Blake said, Redo it. Rashid dipped the mop. Blake said, Slower. Rashid slowed. Blake said, See? When you listen. Rashid's hands shook. A woman nearby whispered, That's wrong. Her friend said, Don't get involved. Blake said, You hear that? They agree with me. Rashid looked up. They don't. Blake smiled. You think you know. Rashid wiped the floor. Blake said, Eyes down. Rashid lowered his gaze. Blake said, Good. Rashid felt anger burn in his chest. He swallowed it. The guard said, Sir, he's doing it. Blake said, Watch him. Minutes passed. The mop moved back and forth. Blake's radio crackled. Ops, this is front desk. Blake pressed the button. Go. We got a call about a disturbance. Blake looked at Rashid. From him. Rashid said, I didn't call. Blake said, Someone did. The guard asked, Who? Blake said, Doesn't matter. The radio said, Police en route. Rashid froze. Blake smiled. Now we do this right, Blake said. Rashid's phone buzzed again. He glanced. Text, officer known for compliance cases. Rashid felt his stomach sink. Blake said, You nervous? Rashid said, No. Blake said, You should be. Footsteps echoed at the entrance. Blue lights flashed on the glass. Blake crossed his arms. Good, he said. Authority is here. Rashid stood by the bucket. The doors slid open. A uniformed officer walked in. Rashid's heart pounded. Blake pointed. That's him, Blake said. He won't cooperate. The officer looked at Rashid. Is that true? He asked. Rashid opened his mouth to speak. Blake said, He's aggressive. Rashid felt the room tighten around him. The officer stepped closer. Sir, he said, put the mop down. Rashid didn't move. Put the mop down, the officer said. Rashid looked at the officer's badge. His name was Harris. The metal shined under the mall lights. I'm working, Rashid said. Blake folded his arms. See. Refuses simple commands. Officer Harris stepped closer. Sir, when I speak you listen. Rashid placed the mop against the wall. Slow. Careful. There, he said. It's down. Harris nodded once. Good. Now step away from it. Rashid stepped back. Blake said, He's been causing problems all morning. Rashid said, I was cleaning. Harris looked at Blake. What kind of problems? Attitude, Blake said. Talking back. Won't follow orders. Rashid said, I followed every order. Harris turned to Rashid. You arguing with management? No. Blake laughed. Hear that? Rashid felt the floor cold through his shoes. Harris said, Why were we called? Blake said, Disturbance. He made customers uncomfortable. Rashid said, I didn't talk to them. Harris's eyes stayed on Rashid. You raise your voice. No. Blake said, he did. Rashid whispered, That's not true. Harris tilted his head. Sir, keep your voice firm. I am firm, Rashid said. Blake said, That's what I mean. Harris sighed. What's your name? Rashid. Last name? Cole. Harris wrote it down. ID. I have a staff badge. Not enough. Rashid reached into his pocket slowly. My wallet is here. Slow, Harris said. Rashid pulled it out. His hands shook. Harris studied the card. You from around here? Yes. Blake said, He's new. I've been here 3 years, Rashid said. Blake smirked. Temporary workers come and go. Rashid looked at Blake. I'm scheduled. Harris looked up. You two always argue like this? Rashid said. No. Blake said. Only when he disobeys. Rashid's chest tightened. Story is already written. Harris said. Sir, did you threaten him? Rashid said. No. Blake said. He was hostile. Rashid said. I was quiet. Harris said. Quiet doesn't mean calm. Rashid looked at the floor. He saw his reflection in the tile. Blake said. He wouldn't clock out. I was told to work, Rashid said. Harris said. Who's your supervisor? Blake. Harris nodded. Then you listened to him. Rashid said. Even if it's wrong? Blake's eyes widened. See. Harris looked at Rashid. You don't question authority. Rashid felt his throat tighten. I just want to clean. Blake said. He keeps playing victim. Harris said. Sir, why didn't you just do what he said? I did, Rashid said. Blake said. After I threatened him. Harris raised an eyebrow. Threatened? Blake shrugged. I told him security would come. Rashid whispered. That's a threat. Harris said. It's procedure. Rashid felt anger flash. He swallowed it. Harris said. You got any weapons? No. Any reason to be nervous? No. Blake said. He looks nervous. Rashid said. Because you called police. Harris said. Lower your voice. I'm not yelling, Rashid said. Blake said. He is now. A small crowd gathered near the store windows. A woman held her phone chest high. Blake noticed. Stop recording. Harris turned. Ma'am, please step back. She did. Rashid said. Why is he believed? Blake said. Because he's in charge. Harris said. Because he reported it. Rashid said. So truth comes from rank? Silence. Harris said. Sir, do you want to leave peacefully? I didn't do anything, Rashid said. Blake said. He's refusing again. Harris said. If you don't leave, I'll escort you. Rashid looked at the mop. Looked at Blake. Looked at Harris. If I leave, Rashid said, I lose my job. Blake said. That's on you. Rashid said. For cleaning? Blake said. For attitude. Harris said. Sir, final warning. Rashid felt his pulse in his ears. Why is my tone a crime? Rashid asked. Harris said. It's not. Then why am I punished? Rashid asked. Blake said. Because you don't fit. Rashid looked at him. Fit what? Blake said. Standards. Harris shifted his weight. Sir, step away from the bucket. Rashid didn't move. Blake smiled. He's resisting. I'm standing, Rashid said. Harris placed his hand on his belt. Don't make this harder. Rashid's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Do you know what happens when police get involved? Blake said softly. Rashid said, yes. Then be smart, Blake said. Harris said, Sir, hands where I can see them. Rashid lifted his hands. Harris stepped closer. You trying to be difficult? No. Blake said, he always is. Rashid said, you called them to scare me. Blake said, I called them to protect my mall. Harris said, Sir, you can file a complaint later. Against who? Rashid asked. Against us, Harris said. Blake laughed. Good luck. Rashid felt cold in his stomach. Harris said, we're done talking. Rashid said, I have the right to stay. Blake said, not here. Harris said, private property. Rashid whispered, so I don't belong anywhere. Blake didn't answer. Harris said, turn around. Rashid froze. Blake smiled. Harris said, I said turn around. Rashid turned slowly. Harris reached for his cuffs. Blake crossed his arms. Rashid felt the metal brush his wrist. His phone buzzed again. He twisted his wrist, just enough to see the screen. Text, phase 2 ready. Evidence secure. Rashid's breath caught. Harris tightened his grip. Stop moving, Harris said. Rashid said, I need to show you something. Blake said, don't listen to him. Harris said, what? Rashid looked over his shoulder. You're arresting the wrong man. Blake said, he's lying. Rashid whispered, I'm not. Harris paused. What do you need to show me? Harris asked. Rashid said, not here. Blake stepped forward. Officer, he's stalling. Harris hesitated. Rashid felt the weight of the moment. Take me to the office, Rashid said. Then I'll show you. Harris looked at Blake. Blake's jaw tightened. Fine, Blake said. Let him talk. Harris released one cuff. Walk, Harris said. Rashid walked. The office door opened again. The mall noise faded. Rashid's heart hammered. Harris said, "Now talk." Rashid reached toward his shoe. Blake shouted, "Hey!" Harris grabbed Rashid's arm. "Don't," Harris said. Rashid froze. "I'm not armed," Rashid said. Blake said, "He's dangerous." Rashid said, "I'm an auditor." Silence hit the room. Blake laughed. "That's funny." Harris stared. "What did you say?" Rashid whispered, "Surprise audit." Blake's smile vanished. Harris said, "Show me." Rashid lifted his foot slowly. The badge slid out. Harris picked it up. "Read it." Looked at Rashid. Then at Blake. Blake took a step back. Harris's voice dropped. "Sir," he said, "we need to talk." Blake said, "That's fake." Rashid said, "Check the number." Harris turned the badge over. Blake's face went pale. The door handle rattled. Someone outside knocked. "Police," a voice called. Harris looked at Blake. "Stay here." Rashid felt his knees shake. Blake whispered, "You planned this." Rashid said, "You showed me." The door opened. A second officer stepped in. "What's going on?" he asked. Harris held up the badge. The officer frowned. Blake's mouth opened. No sound came out. Officer Harris closed the office door. The second officer stared at the badge. "That real?" Harris nodded. "Looks like it." Blake's face flushed. "This is a setup." Rashid said, "It's an audit." Blake snapped, "You lied." "I didn't," Rashid said. "I cleaned." "You spoke." Harris looked at Blake. "Sir, I need you to stay calm." Blake laughed. "He baited me." Rashid said, "You chose your words." Silence filled the room. Harris said, "Mr. Turner, did you threaten his job?" Blake said, "I manage staff." "That's not the question," Harris said. Blake crossed his arms. "I corrected him." Rashid said, "In public." Harris said, "That true?" Blake hesitated. "It's called leadership." Rashid felt the tension shift. The air felt thinner. Harris said, "Do you have a history of complaints?" Blake said, "No." The second officer said, "We can check." Blake looked away. Rashid's phone buzzed. He didn't look. Harris said, "Mr. Turner, I need to step outside with you." Blake said, "No." Harris said, "It's not a request." Blake stared at Rashid. "You think you won?" "I think I listened," Rashid said. Blake walked out with Harris. The second officer stayed. "You okay?" he asked Rashid. Rashid nodded. "I am now." The officer said, "That was close." Rashid said, "It's always close." The officer looked at the mop. "You really a cleaner?" "For today," Rashid said. Outside, voices rose and fell. Rashid heard Blake's tone change. Fast. Sharp. Then quiet. He leaned against the desk. Document, he thought. Time. Words. Witnesses. The door opened. Harris came back in. Alone. "Corporate is on the way," Harris said. Rashid blinked. "Already?" Harris said, "They take badges like yours seriously." Rashid felt relief and fear mix in his chest. "What about him?" Rashid asked. "He's waiting," Harris said. "Not happy." Rashid nodded. Harris said, "We'll keep this calm." Rashid said, "It won't be." They stepped out. Blake stood near the escalator. 2 guards beside him. People whispered. A store clerk leaned out. A cleaner watched from behind a pillar. Blake saw Rashid. His eyes burned. "You think this is justice?" Blake said. Rashid said, "It's process." Blake scoffed. "Process protects you." Rashid said, "Process shows patterns." Blake said, "You people love patterns." Rashid felt the words land. Harris said, "Sir." Blake stopped. Rashid saw the other workers. Bent backs. Tired eyes. A woman cleaner met his gaze. She nodded once. Rashid felt weight in his chest. Blake said loudly, "Everyone back to work." No one moved. Blake said, "I said move." A man in a vest whispered, "He always does this." Rashid heard it. Blake glared. "Who said that?" No one answered. Harris said, "Sir, lower your voice." Blake pointed at Rashid. "He caused this." Rashid said, "You did." Blake laughed. "You wore a costume." "I wore your job," Rashid said. A murmur spread. Blake said, "You tricked us." Rashid said, "I watched you." Blake turned to the guards. "Get them back to work." The guards hesitated. Rashid saw fear in their eyes too. A mall director rushed in. Tie crooked. "What's happening?" he asked. Harris said, audit issue. The director looked at Rashid's badge. His face changed. Sir, the director said to Rashid, we weren't told. Rashid said, that's the point. Blake said, this is unfair. The director said, not now. Blake said, he's lying. Rashid said, check your logs. The director said, we will. Rashid's phone buzzed again. Text, collect witness statements. Rashid looked around. He stepped toward the woman cleaner. Can I ask you something? Rashid said. She hesitated. He watches us. Blake snapped, don't talk to him. Rashid said, it's okay. The woman whispered, he yells. Another worker said, cuts brakes. A third said, calls us slow. Blake raised his voice. Enough. Harris said, sir. Blake's shoulders dropped a little. The director said, we need a meeting. Blake said, about him? About everything, the director said. Rashid felt the crowd shift closer. The teen with the phone was back. Rashid nodded at him. The teen whispered, I saved it. Rashid said, thank you. Blake said, you're ruining my store. Rashid said, you ruined your team. Blake's face twisted. You don't know them. I do, Rashid said. I worked beside them. Blake scoffed. For 1 hour. Rashid said, 1 hour was enough. The director said, we'll hold a staff meeting. Blake turned. Now. Yes, the director said. Now. Blake laughed, but it sounded thin. Rashid felt tension coil in his stomach. The director said, all supervisors report. Workers whispered. Blake stared at Rashid. You wanted a show. Rashid said, I wanted truth. Blake said, truth is power. Rashid said, not forever. The director motioned to the guards. Bring everyone. People began to move. Rashid followed. Blake walked ahead. His back was stiff. They entered a conference room with glass walls. Workers filled the hallway outside. Blake stood at the front. The director stood beside him. Rashid took a seat near the door. Blake cleared his throat. This is about discipline, Blake said. Rashid felt the air tighten. The director looked at Rashid. Mr. Cole, you may speak. Blake's eyes widened. Rashid stood. Blake whispered, don't. Rashid said, I will. The room went quiet. Rashid opened his mouth. Blake slammed his hand on the table. You're not staff, Blake said. You're nothing. Rashid felt the moment break. Outside, more workers pressed to the glass. The director said, let him talk. Blake shook his head. If he talks, I walk. Rashid saw fear in Blake's eyes for the first time. He felt his heart race. He knew what he was about to say would change everything. He took a breath, and the door locked behind him. The lock clicked. Rashid felt the sound in his chest. Blake stood at the table. The director stood beside him. Harris leaned near the door. Workers filled the hallway. Faces pressed to glass. Blake said, this meeting is for staff. Rashid said, they are staff. Blake's jaw tightened. They don't need to hear lies. Rashid looked at the director. May I speak? The director nodded. Briefly. Rashid turned to the room. I was hired to clean today. Blake laughed. You were hired to spy. I was hired to observe, Rashid said. There's a difference. Blake said, you baited me. I followed orders, Rashid said. You changed them. Blake pointed. He refused to clock out. Rashid said, I was told to clean, then told to leave. That's conflict. Blake said, leadership decides. Rashid said, leadership explains. A murmur moved through the hallway. Blake said, he's turning them. Rashid said, they heard you. Blake faced the glass. Back to work. No one moved. Blake said, I said move. A cleaner in the hall spoke. You yell. Blake snapped, quiet. The director raised a hand. Let them talk. Blake stared. This is insubordination. Rashid said, it's testimony. Blake laughed. Listen to him. Big words. Rashid said, small actions hurt. Blake said, you're soft. Rashid said, you're loud. The room tensed. Harris said, let's keep this calm. Blake said, calm is what they want. Rashid said, calm is what they need. Blake turned to the director. Fire him. The director hesitated. We need facts. Blake said, I am the fact. Rashid felt anger rise. He kept his voice steady. Here are facts. He held up his phone. Timestamps. Quotes. Blake said, Fake. Rashid said, ask them. He nodded to the glass. A man in a vest said, he calls us slow. A woman said, he cuts brakes. Another said, he makes jokes about names. Blake said, they're bitter. Rashid said, they're tired. Blake said, you coached them. Rashid said, you trained them. Blake slammed the table. Enough. The director flinched. Blake said, I built this place. Rashid said, you run it. Blake said, same thing. Rashid said, not when people hurt. Blake pointed at Rashid. You made this public. Rashid said, you did. Blake said, you want a show? Rashid said, I want change. Blake said, you want my job. Rashid said, I want your behavior. The hallway went quiet. Blake's face reddened. You think you're better. Rashid said, I think we're equal. Blake scoffed. Prove it. Rashid looked at Harris. Officer, did I threaten anyone? Harris said, no. Rashid said, did I raise my voice? Harris paused. No. Rashid turned to the director. Did he? The director looked at Blake. We heard him. Blake said, so what? Rashid said, so pattern. Blake said, so control. Rashid said, so abuse. Blake's mouth tightened. You don't get to label me. Rashid said, your words did. Blake took a step toward Rashid. You don't belong in this room. Harris stepped in. Back up. Blake stopped. Rashid felt his heart beat loud. This is the line. Blake said, I make examples. Rashid said, you make fear. Blake said, fear keeps order. Rashid said, fear hides truth. The director said, we need statements. Blake said, from who? From them, the director said, pointing to the hall. Blake shook his head. They'll lie. Rashid said, they will speak. The director opened the door. Workers stepped in. One by one. A woman cleaner stood first. He calls me girl. Blake said, you are a girl. She said, I'm 40. A man said, he says my name wrong on purpose. Blake said, names are hard. Rashid said, respect is easy. Blake laughed sharp. You're loving this. Rashid said, I hate it. Blake said, then stop. Rashid said, then change. Blake turned to the director. You're letting him run this. The director said, I'm listening. Blake said, to gossip. Rashid said, to harm. Blake said, to weakness. Rashid said, to work. A guard whispered to Harris. Harris nodded. The director said, corporate is on the line. Blake's head snapped up. Now. Yes, the director said. Video. Blake's smile returned. Good. Rashid felt his stomach twist. The screen lit up. A woman's face appeared. We're joining. Blake said, I want this on record. Rashid said, so do I. Blake leaned toward the camera. I have an employee causing trouble. Rashid said, I have a manager causing harm. The woman on the screen looked between them. Who is the employee? Blake pointed. Him. Rashid raised his badge. The woman's eyes widened. Mr. Cole. Blake froze. The woman said, proceed. Rashid took a breath. Blake whispered, don't. Rashid said, today at 9:12 you said, your kind needs watching. Blake's face drained. The woman said, is that true? Blake said, context. Rashid said, at 9:18 you ordered me to clock out for tone. Blake said, policy. Rashid said, at 9:25 you called police. The woman said, why? Blake said, safety. Rashid said, no threat existed. Blake said, you're twisting. Rashid said, I'm reading. The hallway held its breath. The woman said, continue. Rashid said, witnesses confirm. Blake said, they're coached. Rashid said, they're consistent. Blake slammed his fist. This is a witch hunt. Rashid said, this is a mirror. The woman on the screen said, we need a pause. Blake smiled. Finally. She said, for you. Blake's smile faltered. She said, Mr. Turner, step out. Blake said, what? Now, she said. Blake looked at Rashid. You did this. Rashid said, you did. Blake stepped back from the table. Harris opened the door. Blake walked out. Workers watched. The door closed behind him. The woman on the screen said, Mr. Cole, stay. Rashid felt his legs shake. She said, we're opening a formal case. Rashid nodded. The screen went dark. The room stayed quiet. The director said, "This isn't over." Rashid looked at the glass wall. Blake stood outside, staring in. His eyes were cold. He raised his phone. Rashid's phone buzzed. "Unknown, you'll regret this." Rashid swallowed. Blake turned and walked away. The guards shifted. Harris said, "We need to move you." "Where?" Rashid asked. Harris said, "Safe office." Rashid followed. Behind him, the conference room filled with whispers. Ahead, a door opened. Inside, the lights were low. Rashid stepped in. The door shut, and the lock clicked again. The safe office smelled like dust and coffee. Rashid stood near the wall. Harris leaned against the door. "You good?" Harris asked. Rashid nodded. "I've been worse." Harris said, "He's angry." Rashid said, "He was angry before." Harris looked at the camera in the corner. "This place records sound." "Good," Rashid said. Harris checked his radio. "Corporate wants quiet." Rashid said, "Truth is loud." Harris didn't answer. Footsteps passed outside. Fast. Heavy. Rashid's phone buzzed. Text. Police report shows bias flags on responding officer. Rashid looked at Harris. Harris saw the look. "What?" Rashid said, "You were flagged." Harris stiffened. "For what?" "Excessive stops," Rashid said. "Mostly cleaners. Vendors." Harris frowned. "I follow calls." Rashid said, "You followed Blake." Silence sat between them. Harris said, "I treated you fair." Rashid said, "You treated him first." Harris shifted his weight. "He's management." Rashid said, "I'm human." Harris looked away. The door opened. The director stepped in. "We need to talk." Rashid said, "About him?" "About you," the director said. Rashid felt tension rise. "Me." The director closed the door. "Corporate wants your statement." "I gave it." "They want more detail," the director said. "About the police." Harris straightened. "What about us?" The director said, "Your role." Harris frowned. "I kept it calm." Rashid said, "You believed him." Harris said, "He's a manager." Rashid said, "That's not evidence." The director said, "We need to show fairness." Harris said, "Are you saying I was biased?" The director said, "I'm saying the report matters." Harris looked at Rashid. "You trying to burn me too?" Rashid shook his head. "I'm trying to stop fires." Harris said, "You think I hate you?" Rashid paused. "I think you don't see me." Harris looked down. "I saw a call." Rashid said, "You saw a role." The director said, "We're separating parties." Harris asked, "Meaning?" "You're off the floor," the director said. Harris's face tightened. "Suspended?" "Reviewed," the director said. Harris exhaled hard. Rashid felt a mix of relief and guilt. Harris said, "So Blake gets punished and I get flagged." Rashid said, "The system gets checked." Harris said, "You planned this." Rashid said, "I plan to clean." Harris laughed once. "Funny job." Rashid's phone buzzed again. Text. Blake attempting to contact legal. Rashid said, "He's preparing." The director said, "So are we." Harris said, "He won't go quietly." Rashid said, "They never do." The director looked at Rashid. "We need you to show partial authority." "Why?" Rashid asked. "To keep him from acting out," the director said. "He respects titles." Rashid felt a knot form. "He disrespects people." "Then use the title," the director said. Rashid nodded slowly. They walked into the hall. Blake stood near the exit with his phone to his ear. "I want a lawyer," Blake said. "Now." He saw Rashid. His mouth curled. "Look who they sent." Rashid stood straight. "Corporate asked you to wait." Blake said, "You're not my boss." Rashid lifted his badge. "Right now I am process." Blake laughed. "You're a janitor with a card." Rashid said, "And you're a manager with warnings." Blake stepped closer. "You cost me." Rashid said, "You cost them." Blake pointed at a cleaner. "They cost me time." Rashid said, "They made you money." Blake said, "Not enough." Rashid said, "Never enough for men like you." Blake's eyes flared. "Careful." Rashid felt fear and stood anyway. "Threats are also violations." Blake said, "Prove it." Rashid nodded to the camera above. "Already did." Blake glanced up. "You think cameras know tone?" Rashid said, "They know words." Blake said, "Words don't hurt." Rashid said, ask them. A worker whispered, they do. Blake snapped, quiet. Rashid said, not today. Blake laughed. You think you won? Rashid said, I think you're seen. Blake said, seen by who? Rashid said, by them. Blake looked around. Workers didn't look away. Blake's face twitched. His phone rang. He answered. Yes. His eyes narrowed. What? Silence. He said, that's not final. More silence. Blake lowered the phone. Rashid watched his hands shake. What did they say? Rashid asked. Blake said, temporary leave. Rashid said, that's not nothing. Blake said, it's not everything. Rashid said, it's the door. Blake whispered, you enjoy this. Rashid said, I survive it. Blake looked at Harris. You letting him do this? Harris said, orders. Blake laughed. Always orders. Rashid said, that's what you taught. Blake stepped back. This isn't over. Rashid said, it never is. The director said, Mr. Turner, please exit. Blake stared at Rashid one last time. You made enemies, Blake said. Rashid said, you made records. Blake walked toward the exit. The glass doors slid open. Cold air rushed in. Blake disappeared into the parking lot. Rashid felt his legs weaken. Harris said, you okay? Rashid said, I'm still standing. The director said, corporate wants a full audit now. Rashid nodded. They'll find more. Harris said, of him? Of all of it, Rashid said. A worker approached. Thank you. Rashid said, I just listened. She said, that's new. Rashid felt something heavy lift from his chest. His phone buzzed. Text, prepare full report. Legal team engaged. Rashid looked at the mall. The lights felt too bright. The floor was still wet where he had mopped. Rashid walked back to the spill. He picked up the mop. A guard watched him. Still cleaning? The guard asked. Rashid said, still working. The guard nodded. Rashid pushed the mop once more. Behind him, workers whispered. Ahead, sirens faded. And somewhere outside, Blake's car engine started. Rashid knew the story wasn't done. Not yet. The conference room smelled like coffee and lemon wipes. Too clean. Too quiet. Elias sat at the long table with 4 managers. His cleaning cart waited outside the door. Mr. Trent stood near the window, arms folded. Ms. Keller sat with the tablet. 2 corporate men stood near the screen. One said, we're here for the surprise audit. Mr. Trent smiled. Perfect timing. He looked at Elias. Why is he here? The room went still. Ms. Keller said, he requested to observe. Mr. Trent laughed. This is a management meeting. Elias spoke. Company policy allows any employee to attend audit hearings. The corporate man blinked. That's true. Mr. Trent's jaw tightened. This man cleans floors. I also check numbers, Elias said. Silence. Ms. Keller cleared her throat. Let's begin. The screen lit up. Sales charts. Inventory logs. Timesheets. The corporate man said, we'll start with staffing. Mr. Trent leaned back. Best team in the district. Elias watched the numbers. They shook slightly on the screen. The auditor said, why are cleaners listed under temporary labor? Mr. Trent said, seasonal work. It's February, the man replied. Mr. Trent shrugged. Paperwork delay. Elias spoke softly. They're full-time. Mr. Trent shot him a look. Stay in your lane. The auditor typed. Who signed these contracts? Mr. Trent said, I did. Why are wages lower than policy minimum? Mr. Trent's smile cracked. Market adjustment. Elias stood. Sir, he said, my pay is $3 under the posted rate. Mr. Trent said, sit down. Ms. Keller looked at the screen again. That's correct. The auditor frowned. This applies to all cleaners? Elias nodded. Yes. Mr. Trent snapped. They don't complain. Elias said, they're afraid. The room tightened. The second corporate man said, show overtime records. A new chart appeared. Red lines. Missing hours. Ms. Keller whispered, oh no. Mr. Trent stood. This is getting ridiculous. The auditor said, why is overtime erased? Mr. Trent said, system glitch. Elias said, every week. Mr. Trent pointed at him. You're accusing me? Elias met his eyes. I'm stating facts. Silence fell heavy. The auditor turned to Elias. Do you have proof? Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small notebook. Hands shaking. I write my hours, he said. And theirs. He opened it. Names. Dates. Numbers. Ms. Keller leaned closer. These match the camera logs. Mr. Trent's face went pale. That notebook is nothing. Elias said. I also have audio. He pressed play on his phone. Mr. Trent's voice filled the room. Don't worry about the hours. People like you don't fight back. The sound cut off. No one breathed. The auditor stood. Mr. Trent, step outside. Mr. Trent stared at Elias. You set me up. Elias said. You did it to yourself. Security opened the door. Mr. Trent walked out, stiff and silent. Ms. Keller covered her mouth. The auditor turned to Elias. You work here as a cleaner? Elias nodded. Why do you know policy? Elias swallowed. My father taught me. The auditor said. We'll need a full statement. Elias sat back down. Heart pounding. But the meeting wasn't over. The second corporate man said. There's another issue. He changed the screen. Complaint files appeared. Why were reports ignored? Ms. Keller whispered. Because they were marked unverified. Elias felt cold. Those were his. The auditor said. Who marked them? Ms. Keller looked at the name. Mr. Trent. The door burst open. A police officer stepped in. Who's Elias Brown? Elias stood slowly. That's me. The officer said. You're under investigation for falsifying company records. The room exploded with gasps. Ms. Keller shouted. That's impossible. The officer held up a paper. A complaint was filed. Elias felt the floor tilt. The officer added, by your manager. Elias looked at the empty doorway. His chest burned. The auditor said, this man exposed fraud. The officer replied, and now he's accused of it. Handcuffs clicked open. Elias raised his hands. And the screen behind them still showed Mr. Trent's lies. The hallway filled with voices. Wait! Stop! You can't do this. The police officer held Elias's arm. Not tight. Not gentle. Sir, Ms. Keller said, this is a corporate investigation. The officer replied, and this is a criminal one. Elias said, what did I falsify? The officer looked at the paper. Time records. Elias laughed once. A dry sound. You just saw the real ones. The officer said, I see a complaint. Ms. Keller stepped forward. That complaint came from Mr. Trent. The officer's eyes narrowed. Where is Mr. Trent? No one answered. The auditor said he was removed. The officer said, so he filed this before he left. Elias's heart hit hard. He planned this, Elias said. The officer said, planning doesn't make it false. They walked. Past desks. Past staring faces. A woman whispered, that's the cleaner. A man said, he stole? Elias kept his eyes forward. Outside, rain had started. Cold and sharp. The patrol car door opened. Elias stopped. Can I call my union? The officer said, after the station. Ms. Keller said, this is wrong. The officer said, then prove it. Door shut. Inside the car, silence. Elias watched the building fade. His phone buzzed. A message from Rosa. They're saying you lied. He typed back. I didn't. Another buzz. From Jamal. They erased our hours again. Elias closed his eyes. At the station, bright lights. Hard chairs. A different officer sat across from him. Name. Elias Brown. Job. Cleaner. The officer raised an eyebrow. Cleaner who audits managers? Elias said, cleaner who follows rules. The officer typed. Your manager claims you edited logs. Elias leaned forward. I showed proof. The officer said, not here. Elias felt the wall close in. Can I see the file? The officer slid it across. Printed screenshots. Numbers changed. Elias stared. That's not mine. The officer said, looks like it. Elias's voice shook. They copied the system and edited it. The officer paused. Do you have proof of that? Elias swallowed. No. The door opened. Another officer whispered something. The first officer stood. Wait here. Elias sat alone. The clock ticked. He thought of his father. Paper doesn't care who you are. But people do. The door opened again. A woman entered. Suit. Badge. Mr. Brown, she said. I'm internal affairs. Elias blinked. For police. She nodded. We received a call from corporate. Elias said, I didn't steal. She said, I know. He froze. She laid a recorder on the table. We have your audio. And theirs. Elias whispered, they altered it. She said, not very well. Relief tried to rise. Fear held it down. She continued, your manager filed a report. Then ran. Elias said, ran where? She looked at her folder. Another store. Different name. Elias laughed. A broken sound. So he wins. She shook her head. No. She slid another paper. A warrant. Elias read it. Search and seizure. His office, she said. His home. Elias breathed in. But why am I here? She said, because the story isn't done. The door opened. The auditor stepped in. We found more, he said. He placed photos on the table. Cash envelopes. Hidden files. A second notebook. Elias stared. That's his. The auditor said. And these are from 3 other stores. The woman from Internal Affairs said. It's bigger than one man. Elias's chest tightened. Then why blame me? She said. Because you were visible. The officer added. And quiet people make easy suspects. Elias looked down. At his hands. Still shaking. The woman said. You're free to go. The cuffs were gone. But the weight stayed. Outside, cameras waited. A reporter shouted. Did you steal money? Another yelled. Were you framed? Elias didn't answer. He walked. Ms. Keller stood by the curb. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For not stopping him sooner. Elias said. You can stop him now. She nodded. But the company is scared, she said. They want distance. Elias felt cold again. They want me gone. She hesitated. They want silence. His phone buzzed. Message from Rosa. They fired Jamal. Elias closed his eyes. The rain came back. Harder. He said. If they punish us, he still wins. Ms. Keller said. What do you want? Elias looked at the building. At the doors. I want it public. She stared. You'll lose your job. Elias said. They already took it. Silence. She said. There's a press conference tomorrow. Elias nodded. Then I'll speak. Ms. Keller whispered. They'll attack your past. Elias said. They already attacked my present. The reporter ran closer. Mr. Brown. Elias stopped. He turned. And for the first time he didn't look down. I didn't steal, he said. I was robbed. The cameras clicked. Behind him, the building lights shut off. The press conference room buzzed with cameras and murmurs. Elias stood at the podium. Badge in his pocket. Hands tight around the lectern. Good morning, he said. Voice steady low. Reporters leaned forward. Phones raised. Lights flashing. One shouted. Were you framed? Elias looked straight ahead. Yes. Another yelled. Did management cover it up? Yes. The room went tense. He took a breath. This is about more than me. It's about every worker silenced by fear. Every voice ignored. Every injustice hidden behind titles. Cameras clicked. Whispers spread. From the back, Blake watched on a screen. Face tight. Fingers drumming the table. Mr. Brown, a reporter said. What happens to your manager? Elias's jaw tightened. The law will handle him. A flash of fear crossed Blake's eyes. Not visible to the cameras. Not yet. Elias continued. Corporate has reviewed his conduct. Multiple complaints were ignored. Overtime was erased. Policies violated. Employees harassed. And now accountability begins. Ms. Keller stood beside him. Silent support. Elias felt a swell of gratitude. Justice, Elias said, is not clean or painless. It leaves scars. It costs trust. It costs safety. And it costs courage. A reporter asked, What about your colleagues? They were afraid, Elias said. They still are. Some lost wages. Some lost breaks. Some feared retaliation. We are rebuilding that trust. Together. Cameras focused on Blake. He swallowed hard. Eyes darting. Phone in hand. No lawyer. No defense. Elias felt the weight of it all. The fear he'd carried. The anger simmering inside. The exhaustion. He lowered his gaze. And yes, he said, there's a cost to justice. A flashback hit him, the mop in the lobby. The first call to the officer. Blake's laughter. The whispers in the hallway. The badge shaking in his hands. The conference room, filled with glass walls, silent witnesses. A deep breath. This is my cost. This is our cost. Cameras clicked. Reporters murmured. Some scribbled notes. Some whispered with neighbors. Elias looked at the employees gathered behind the glass wall. Faces cautious. Curious. Relieved. A woman whispered, finally. A man nodded. Someone sees us. The auditor from corporate stepped forward. He complied fully with internal review. Evidence matches the reports. We are proceeding with disciplinary action against Mr. Trent. Blake's hand trembled. Fingers tight around the phone. Sweat on his brow. He said nothing. Elias knew the legal consequences were coming. Termination, potential fines, investigation into all 3 stores, and maybe more. But the emotional consequences were already here. The fear of retaliation. The bruised trust in management. The knowledge that speaking out cost him hours of stress and nights of worry. A reporter asked, "Are you satisfied?" Elias paused. "I am relieved. But satisfaction is not the point. The point is accountability. The point is change. And the point is making sure this doesn't happen again." Blake's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Message from a lawyer. "No promises," it said. Elias looked at the employees behind him. They cheered quietly. A small, cautious cheer. He whispered, "It's not victory. It's progress." Ms. Keller nodded. "You did it," she said softly. "Not just for you. For them." Elias smiled faintly. Courage has a price. Justice has a price. But silence costs more. Outside, the cameras recorded the story. Inside, Blake retreated to an empty office. Phone in hand. Lawyers on the line. His world crumbling quietly away from the public eye. Elias stepped down from the podium. Hands shaking slightly. Heart heavy yet light. The employees surrounded him. A few whispered thanks. A few shook his hand. Some just smiled. He looked out the window. The city moved around him. People unaware of the battles fought inside corporate walls. Elias whispered, "This is justice, messy and real. And it costs everything. But it is worth it." Behind him, a door clicked. Blake left the building. Defeated, exposed, and powerless. Elias stayed by the window a moment longer. Rain tapped against the glass. The world outside unchanged. But inside, lives had shifted. Rules had changed. And fear had lost some of its grip. A deep breath. And he whispered one last truth. Courage isn't free. But neither is silence.